All right, guys, today we're looking at the French and Indian War and its aftermath. Um, we've been talking a lot about the British and the way that they've been interacting with their colonies. And what we haven't been talking a lot about is the British and the way they've been interacting with other European countries. So that's kind of what this is about. We're going to have a big clash between the French and the British. Now, I know every year when I do this and I talk about the French and Indian War, most kids hear French and Indian War, and I ask, well, who's fighting against each other in the French and Indian War? And the first thing they tell me is, well, the French and the Indians are fighting against each other. It's not called the French and Indian War because the French and Native Americans were fighting. It's called the French and Indian War because the British were fighting against the French and their Native American allies. So we call it the French and Indian War because the French and their Indian allies were the ones fighting against the British. Now, fighting alongside the British will be their American colonies. Um, and it's hard for kids to wrap their heads around this, but the people living in the American colonies were still British citizens. Okay. And so when Great Britain goes to war, the people in the American colonies are going to war too because they're British citizens. All right. So I want to look at the big picture here. France and their Native American allies are fighting against Great Britain and their American colonists. Why are these countries fighting? Well, both sides wanted the Ohio River Valley and surrounding areas. We've been talking a lot about the British colonies, the American colonies, and how the more land you owned, the more influence you had in society, right? So as people continue to move west, they're going to be pushing into areas that are claimed not only by the French, but also areas that are inhabited by Native Americans. So it's a natural alliance between the French and Native Americans that they would be fighting against the British and the American colonists who keep pushing into their territory and into disputed territory. Okay? This is what I mean. Everything you see on this map that is this peach color, this pink orange color, this was British claims. All right, this is land that the British claimed a right to. You'll notice here it's all the east coast that we've been talking about, all the colonies, the southern, middle, and New England colonies. If you look at France, France claims everything in blue. And then if you look at the striped regions, this is land that is claimed by both countries. It's a disputed British and French claim. So you see here the Ohio River Valley, most of West Alabama and Mississippi, all the way to the Mississippi River, up into Canada in what was New France. These are all disputed territories. And this is what we're going to be fighting over in the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is not only fought in North America. There will be fighting that takes place all over the world. There'll be fighting that takes place in Europe, fighting that takes place in Africa, fighting that takes place in India. And when we refer to the French and Indian War on a worldwide scale, we call it the 7 Years' War. But when we talk about the fighting that took place in North America, we refer to it as the French and Indian War. As far as my class goes, you can use those terms synonymously. All right. You can say French and Indian War and 7 Years' War. They're really the same war. Okay. All right. So French and Native Americans were fighting against the British and their American colonists. It was fought because of a common interest in the Ohio River Valley, right? Both sides start building forts in the mid 1700s. Okay. George Washington, who is a British citizen that lives in the American colonies, was asked by the governor of Virginia to kick the French out of Fort Duquesne. Okay, Fort Duquesne, and I know that looks like Duquesne, but you pronounce it Duquesne. This is pronounced Fort Duquesne. George Washington was sent with a message. He was sent with a message to tell the French to leave, right? He wasn't sent to start fighting. He was sent with a message. He sends the message to the French. The French decline to leave. And then as George Washington is leaving, he gets into a skirmish with some French forces and accidentally kills a French courier, a guy named Joseph, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but a guy named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. I don't know. I don't know how to say it. I'm sure some of you guys out there that know French will be able to help me with that pronunciation. But Washington kills this guy, or his men kill this guy, and this starts fighting between the French and the British. Okay, a lot of people point to this event as kind of like the spark that starts the French and Indian War. Okay, so Washington builds a little makeshift fort called Fort Necessity. He's going to be captured at Fort Necessity, and he's going to be held prisoner by the French. Now, he's later released, and the reason George Washington becomes a war hero is because he's standing up to the enemy. He's standing up to the French. So a lot of people in the American colonies and even the British look at George Washington with a little bit of admiration because he stood up to the French. Not because he was victorious, because he wasn't. Okay. He was not successful in kicking the French out of Fort Duquesne. He was captured. He was not successful in defending Fort Necessity. But because he had stood up to the French and was held prisoner, he was held in high esteem. Okay. Now, the British, realizing that they're in for a fight here in North America, they come up with a pretty good plan. Their plan is, we know that the French have been really the best European country in terms of the way they treated Native Americans. They realize that, and they realize that they need to do something to get Native Americans on their side too. So they come up with the Albany Plan of Union. This was a British suggestion that the colonies make an alliance with the Iroquois nation. And this was kind of a victory for the British because the Iroquois agreed to remain neutral in the war and not fight against the British. Okay, so this is a good plan on their part to get the colonists to make buddy-buddy with the Iroquois so that they don't have to fight against the Iroquois and the French and other Native Americans that are helping the French. All right. After George Washington's release, a British commander by the name of Edward Braddock is promoted in the war effort, and he appoints George Washington as his aide. Now, Washington has a lot of things to tell Braddock about Native Americans and their war tactics that were a lot different than British generals were used to seeing. Okay, if you think about warfare up until this time, all the warfare that we've talked about, all the warfare that you've learned about in world history, at least early world history, battles were determined on a battlefield. They were very organized. People used to line up across from each other and take turns shooting at each other until somebody retreated. And that's how you won or lost a battle. Whoever took the battlefield won the battle. Well, that's not how Native Americans fought. And that's not how the French are going to fight in the French and Indian War. A lot of times the French, and all the time Native Americans, would use tactics called guerrilla warfare. And I don't mean guerrilla like an ape. I mean guerrilla like G-U-E. Okay? That's, not G-O-R, but G-U-E. And guerrilla warfare means that you are not fighting by conventional rules. You're not going to line up across from each other and start, shooting at each other, taking turns, lining up in neat little lines. Guerrilla warfare is using things like ambushes, hit and run tactics where you kill people and then run away. And Native Americans had to fight like that because they couldn't match up to British regular soldiers if they were fighting conventionally. So they didn't fight conventionally. They changed the rules of warfare. If you can't win by the conventional rules, then change the rules. Okay, and that's what they did. Washington tries to tell Braddock this, and Braddock has this amazingly arrogant quote that I'm going to pull up for you. He says, "Savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make an impression." Well, that's a pretty cocky and arrogant thing to say. And just like in a movie, as soon as he says that, it's like you said, "I'll be back" in a horror movie. He ain't gonna make it. So Edward Braddock is going to be killed. He's killed near Fort Duquesne in 1755, and George Washington saved the British from disaster by organizing a retreat. He kept the retreat from turning into a panic. He organized the British into an orderly retreat. And so once again, we're adding to the mythos, the character, the hero character of George Washington. Allegedly, during this retreat, George Washington's horse was shot out from under him. He had bullet holes in his hat at the end of this ordeal. He had bullet holes in the cape that was coming off the back of his uniform. So, I don't know if that's true or not, but that is the legend of George Washington during the retreat at Fort Duquesne. Okay. So we've said this just to reiterate. By 1756, fighting had spread to Europe and other parts of the world, and we also refer to the French and Indian War. When the fighting is taking place in other parts, we call it the 7 Years' War. All right. So the French and British, I'm going to spare you all the different battles of the French and Indian War because in terms of our content standards that we have to learn, they're not important. Okay. The only battle that I'm going to talk about in any length is the British victory at the Battle of Quebec. All right. The reason that we talk about Quebec is because it is the turning point of the war in North America. All wars that we're going to talk about, there's going to be a battle that's a turning point where one side starts to win, right? And we can point to the battle at Quebec as the turning point of the French and Indian War. Once the war is over, and the war ends with the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Now, this is one of the few dates that I'm going to ask you to remember in my class. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, we have to know the date because there's also going to be a Treaty of Paris of 1783. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 ends the Revolutionary War. All right? So I have to ask you to know this date. All right? So the Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends the French and Indian War, and it says that it eliminated the French power in North America. Because the French lost, they're going to have to give up their claims to all that territory that they have. And remember, the French had the largest land claims in North America, but had the fewest settlers to protect those land claims. So we're talking about a lot of land that the French are going to have to give up in North America. All right. What we call New France up around Canada was given to the British. Louisiana east of the Mississippi River was given to the British. Florida was given to the British. Now, you say Florida, wait a minute. Did the British own Florida? No, the Spanish owned Florida. However, because Spain had helped the French in the French and Indian War, Florida was given to the British to solidify their East Coast land claims, and then Spain received Louisiana west of the Mississippi River. Okay? So looking at this map, this is what North America is going to look like after the French and Indian War. If you look, we have British land claims over here, the 13 colonies on the East Coast, and up in Canada. Though that was claimed by the British before the war. After the war, the British claimed pretty much all of this territory up to the Mississippi River. Okay, so everything in light pink and orange is now claimed by the British. Okay, down here you see that Florida was lost by Spain, but given and given to the British. But now Spain is going to gain some territory too. Over here in the I guess the light yellow color here, Spain is going to gain control of all of this territory that we would have called Louisiana, right? So while the French controlled Louisiana before the war, the Spanish are going to control it after the war. All right, moving on. After the war, the colonies are going to be upset, continually more and more upset with the British. All right, and we're leading up to I tell you what, we're going to stop this right here, and then we're going to have a part 2 to this section because it is so long. So we'll finish up right here with the land claims after the French and Indian War, and we'll pick up with the next video on the colonies' uh, deteriorating relationship with Great Britain. All right.